and we would just automatically, then pass it over to them. But we back then, the policy people, we had to do all the governor's correspondence. What I found the best way for me to get my ideas involved was help write the governor's speeches. Because the speechwriters always had too much to do. And again, I sort of a quasi-journalist, I was good at writing. I would wander down and talk to them, and I'd say, well, what do you got to write a speech about? Well, this or that. So what if I write a few paragraphs? So I was able to push some ideas about liberalizing marijuana penalties, for example, in the governor's speeches, because I knew how he worded things, because I had drafted letters for him when he was lieutenant governor. And he had a certain style of language, and you had to have rounded edges on things. And when you would be pushing something like marijuana penalties, you'd have to have some line about we're still going to enforce the law, but this is a health issue and we have to deal with it. And I knew how to articulate some things for him. Similarly, we had student riots on campus, and we would get boxes of letters. And I had to write an answer for the governor to all of those. And I remember having three piles. The people that said we should nuke the campuses and teach those kids a lesson. Another, the squish liberals that felt we should be more sensitive to their needs. And a very small stack of people that said, Governor, this is a very difficult issue. You've got to do something. So I drafted 3 letters that all reflected the governor's exact views, but with sufficient emphasis to try to appeal to the instinct of whichever stack of papers I was responding to.
In 1970, Bill McLellan runs for governor on his own, and he's up against Sander Levin, a state senator from southeastern Michigan. And it's a very, very close election, but McLellan pulls it out and is elected for a 4-year term. That Thanksgiving, there is something that is called the Thanksgiving Massacre. Could you explain that?
Yeah, the governor won a full term, and he decided he had become close to Jack Dempsey, who was a Democrat who was a strong supporter of his, and I think he'd been on television or something, but he had run for Congress and lost, but Jack Dempsey, he brought him in to replace Jim Kellogg as the head of policy. And then several different people were moved on out. For me, they told me I was going to be promoted upstairs from the basement of the Capitol where the policy people were to an office right outside the governor's. The governor said he wanted me there. Well, it was the worst thing that happened in my career because even though I had an office right outside the governor, nobody had to go through me. He also took my secretary and made her his secretary. And so I had this great office that people would come in and say, boy, this guy must be powerful. But I would just sit there and, twiddle my thumbs. And it was the new regime. I didn't really fit into it in a way that I had been. And so I came up with other issues that I could pursue on my own because nobody was really supervising me. I mean, the governor isn't going to check in and say, what's going on, Richard? And so I didn't report to anybody, but so I worked there 2 more years, and it was not as fun as being in the midst of the policy dispute. I did want to say something about that 1970 campaign. 2 things that, since money in politics is always very important, I remember 2 things. John Stalin came to me and one day, and he had a note, and I had to sign a letter to borrow $10,000 from the Belding Bank to pay for the campaign. And I had to, personally, I was paid $14,000 a year, and so borrowing $10,000. I said, John, do I have to do this? He said, yeah, you do, we'll pay it back, but they want personal guarantees. So of course I had a job, so I signed it. Later on, John Stalin, again, who was one of my mentors and a great guy, was talking about money. And they got some money from one of these mafia guys, $10,000. And since I was the governor's aide on organized crime, I said, well, you sent it back, didn't you? He said, well, I sent $9,000 back. I said, John, you can't do that. well, I know, but we need the money, $1,000. And I always thought, that's politics. And 10,000 would have been inappropriate, but, we needed 1,000 and we took that 1,000.
So there were no contribution limits because we had no Michigan campaign finance.
Oh yeah, there was.
Well,
yes.
we had a Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah, no, we had limits. 68, we had limits. That's why I was chairman of People for Rockefeller, because there was limits, and Rockefeller created hundreds of committees, not unlike what we did later for John Engler in the Senate, created a whole raft of committees. So you did have these limits, and you would have to get around them by doing a lot of things. So. Yeah, the limits, if
So
they
being
were,
the guarantor of a loan wasn't considered at that time a
no,
contribution.
I don't. And if it was, I don't know. What did I know?
Yeah.
It was later that I became expert on campaign finance, but not until after Watergate.
So you decide that it's time to leave state government and hang out your own shingle as Richard McLellan, attorney at law.
Yes.
Before you did that, though, you had to, you were, for at least for a brief period of time, the drug czar of Michigan.
Right. I had been right from the beginning. In 1969, when I went on the governor's staff, there was no drug abuse program in state government at all. There was alcoholism programs for basically older white men. But the alcohol industry alcoholism people didn't want anything to do with drug abuse. They were black, younger, different drugs, and they thought alcoholism was special. Governor said, no, we have to start having a drug abuse program. So I remember met with him, and he said, well, I said, okay, Governor, we could create an office of drug abuse. Do you want it in the governor's office, or do you want it in the Department of Public Health? He said, why don't we put it in the governor's office? And I said, okay. So we created this Office of Drug Abuse just by press release. George Weeks, the governor's press secretary, called me and said, there's a guy, I'm sending him down, Alex Lagas, hire him. Your job is to hire him. And I had some control over the crime control money. So Alex became the head of the Office of Drug Abuse, and he was just a reporter. We then took $10,000, I think, and we made a movie about the drug abuse programs around the state, that the governor would participate. He would go to a school, he would go to a hospital, whatever little programs we could find, the governor would get there and he would talk about this program as if it was part of the state's effort. And I remember we made those movies. I'd love to see if one is still around, because that's what you did back then. There was no internet, no that sort of thing. But we basically created the state's drug abuse problem as a, smoke and mirrors for that to get off the ground. Then over the years, more and more money started to flow. So the governor, we ultimately drafted a bill called the Office of Substance Abuse Services, OSAS, and created a real agency. I was the last head of the Office of Drug Abuse for about the last 60 days or something, because whoever had it had moved on. And so then I did that, and then I left. And the new OSAS was created, and I left and went into private practice. So those kinds of issues, again, my experience, long-term experience, I have seen these issues through the whole cycle. OSAS lasted 10, 15 years, and then it dwindled into the bureaucracy somewhere, and I'm sure the money is still being sent, but it's not very high priority anymore.
Before we leave the governor's office, well, let's just talk about a few personalities there. Were you knew Joyce Braithwaite quite
The Dragon
well.
Lady was the governor's. I knew her when she was the secretary to Ellie Peterson, the vice chairman of the Republican Party, because I worked for the Republican Party in 1963 in the summer. And so I knew Joyce.
That's when Bill Ballinger was research director.
Bill Ballinger was the research director, and I worked for the party. And because I worked for the party, I was able to use their print room for my ill-fated campaign for student body president. I remember one weekend we took all the paper that the Republican Party had, and back then you mimeographed things and you used the mails. Well, Ellie came in the next morning and the whole paper room was empty. Well, we said, well, but Ellie, you said we could use some paper. It's a big campus. And she wasn't mad. She just, so that's what I did. So later on, I worked for the party. And then, what was the question?
Well, we were talking about Joyce Braithwaite.
Joyce Braithwaite. So the key players that I remember in the governor's office were Don Gordon, the first chief of staff, who had been his chief of staff as lieutenant governor, one-term legislator, I think. And Don then had to leave after the Thanksgiving massacre because they had offered a job to Jimmy Del Rio's girlfriend. And Don had